The storm clouds gathered above the towering castle perched atop the hills of Hungary, its shadow stretching long and dark over the surrounding countryside. The villagers below whispered prayers as they barred their windows and doors, knowing all too well the horrors that lay within. It was said that no young maiden who entered the gates of Choctitch Castle ever returned. At the center of these whispered fears was Elizabeth Bathory, the Countess, a woman of ethereal beauty and chilling cruelty. Her name alone was enough to send shivers down spines. But it wasn't just her thirst for blood that made her infamous. It was the dark, twisted love life that drove her into the annals of history as a creature of nightmares. Elizabeth had been beautiful in her youth, hair the color of midnight, skin pale and smooth as porcelain, and eyes that gleamed with an intelligence and fire that drew men and women alike. Her beauty was both a blessing and a curse, for it became her obsession. She would go to any lengths to preserve it, and the price of her vanity would be paid in blood. Her marriage to Ferenc Nadasdy, a brutal warrior known as the Black Knight of Hungary, was one of convenience and power. Together they were a fearsome duo, ruling their lands with an iron fist and instilling fear into the hearts of their enemies. But the love between them was cold, distant, and pragmatic. Ferenc cared little for Elizabeth's needs, leaving her alone in the castle for long stretches as he waged wars. It was during these lonely nights that Elizabeth's darker desires began to take root. It started innocently enough, or so it seemed. A young handmaiden spilled wine on Elizabeth's dress one evening during a feast. The Countess, livid, struck the girl with the back of her hand. Blood splattered onto Elizabeth's skin, and she paused. Something about the warmth of the blood on her flesh sent a shiver down her spine. As she gazed at the crimson droplets on her hand, an idea, a dark and terrible idea, took hold. Elizabeth became convinced that the blood of young women held the secret to eternal youth and beauty. Her obsession grew insidious, consuming her every waking moment. Soon she began summoning maidens to the castle under the pretense of offering them work. The castle maids whispered of screams that echoed through the stone halls at night, but none dared speak out. Elizabeth was untouchable. Her title and wealth shielded her from suspicion. But her dark practices weren't merely about vanity. They became intertwined with her search for love. After Ferenc's death, Elizabeth was free to indulge in her every desire without restraint. She surrounded herself with a loyal entourage of servants who shared in her depravity, including her confidant, a witch named Anna Darvulia. Together they devised rituals and experiments meant to summon dark forces and grant Elizabeth eternal beauty. These rituals often involved Elizabeth bathing in the blood of virgins, a grotesque and horrifying spectacle that became the core of her legend. Elizabeth's love life took a darker, more twisted turn as she sought companionship in the young women she lured into her castle. She would charm them with her wit and beauty, promising them a life of luxury, only to betray them in the most horrific ways. She would wine and dine her victims, treating them like royalty, before leading them to the castle's torture chambers. There her affections would turn into a sadistic frenzy. Elizabeth would caress their faces with a cold tenderness, whispering promises of eternal love, before tearing them apart, physically and emotionally. Her desire for beauty and power eclipsed any genuine affection she might have felt. Love, for Elizabeth, became a game of dominance and control. But there was one girl, Ilona, who stood out among the countless victims. Ilona was different. She had a fire in her spirit that reminded Elizabeth of herself in her younger years. When Elizabeth looked into Ilona's eyes, she saw a reflection of her own strength and defiance. Ilona was a village girl with no noble blood, but her beauty was unparalleled and her sharp tongue intrigued the Countess. Elizabeth didn't want to destroy Ilona, not immediately. She wanted to possess her, to bend her will and make her an eternal companion. For weeks, Elizabeth courted Ilona, showering her with gifts and affection. Ilona, though wary, found herself drawn to the Countess despite the rumors that surrounded her. There was a magnetic pull, an undeniable allure to Elizabeth that few could resist. But Ilona was no fool. She had heard the whispers of the girls who disappeared after entering the castle gates. She played along with Elizabeth's seduction, all the while plotting her escape. One night, As Elizabeth prepared another grotesque ritual, Ilona slipped away into the bowels of the castle, hoping to find an exit. What she found instead were the remains of Elizabeth's countless victims, piles of bones and blood-soaked garments hidden behind a false wall. Ilona's scream echoed through the halls, drawing Elizabeth's attention. The Countess appeared, her pale face illuminated by the flickering light of a candelabra. Her expression was not one of anger, but of sorrow. "Why did you look, my love?" Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling with something that almost resembled regret. "I wanted to protect you from this. I wanted you to be different." Ilona backed away, her heart pounding as Elizabeth advanced. There was a madness in the Countess's eyes, but there was also something else, desperation. For the first time, Ilona saw the cracks in Elizabeth's facade. Beneath the beauty and power was a woman terrified of being alone, terrified of losing the one thing she had fought so hard to preserve, her youth. Elizabeth reached for Ilona, but the girl bolted, running through the dark corridors of the castle. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows reaching out like claws. She could hear Elizabeth's voice calling after her, a haunting melody that sent chills down her spine. "You can't leave me, Ilona," the Countess sang. "No one ever leaves me." Ilona managed to find her way to the main hall, but Elizabeth was already there, standing by the massive oak doors, her gown stained with fresh blood. In her hands she held a dagger, its blade glinting in the dim light. "If I can't have your love," Elizabeth said, her voice cold and resolute, "then I'll take your beauty instead." What followed was a struggle unlike anything Ilona had ever known. She fought with everything she had, her screams piercing the night as the villagers below looked up at the castle, their faces pale with fear. No one dared to intervene. No one dared to enter the Bloody Countess's domain. When morning came, the castle was silent. The servants found Ilona's body in the great hall, her lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. Elizabeth sat beside her, cradling her head in her lap. The Countess's face was smeared with tears and blood, her once beautiful features now twisted with grief and madness. It was said that after Ilona's death, Elizabeth became even more unhinged, her rituals growing more violent and desperate. She believed that Ilona's blood would grant her eternal youth, but instead, it became her undoing. The villagers, emboldened by rumors of her crimes, rose up against her. Elizabeth was arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment in her own castle, where she spent her final days walled up in a small room with no light, no mirrors, and no one to love. The legend of Elizabeth Bathory, the Bloody Countess, lives on, her dark love life and insatiable thirst for beauty serving as a chilling reminder of the lengths to which obsession can drive a soul. And some say that on stormy nights when the wind howls through the hills of Hungary, you can still hear her voice whispering from the shadows, "Stay with me, my love, forever."